On the morning of June 30th, 1908, a man named Se-Me-Nof was sitting on the porch of his home at the Vahna-Va-Ra trading post in Siberia. It was just after 7 in the morning. Quiet, the kind of morning that starts the same as all the others. Then the northern sky tore open. A light appeared, brighter than the sun, he said. A wave of heat followed, so intense he was certain his shirt was about to ignite. Then the shock wave hit. It threw him off the porch and knocked him unconscious. When scientists finally reached the place this had come from, 19 years later, they found 80 million trees flattened across 2,000 square kilometers of Siberian forest. And no crater, not even a small one. You're listening to The Unlit Room. Every story in here actually happened. That's the part that should scare you. New stories every day, Monday through Saturday. This episode's narration is AI-generated. The research, writing, and editorial decisions behind every story are made with care for accuracy and respect for those involved. Today, the largest impact-type event in recorded history, and the mystery of what caused it took the world nearly a century to fully explain. The Podkarmen-Naya Tunguska River runs through one of the most remote stretches of central Siberia, taiga forest so vast and so empty that 100 people might live in an area the size of Belgium. In 1908, the nearest outpost of any size was the Vahna-Va-Ra trading post, 60 kilometers from where the blast would occur. The Evenki people, indigenous reindeer herders who had lived in this taiga for centuries, were the ones closest to it when it happened. The detonation occurred at roughly 7:14 local time on a Tuesday morning. Whatever the object was, and scientists would argue about that for a century, it detonated several kilometers above the surface of the Earth, releasing energy estimated at somewhere between 10 and 15 megatons. For comparison, the bomb dropped on Hiroshima released about 13 kilotons. The Tunguska event was roughly 1,000 times more powerful. The pressure wave knocked down trees across 2,000 square kilometers, 80 million of them. The pattern they fell in, all pointing outward from a single central point, like the spokes of a wheel, would later tell scientists more about the physics of the event than any piece of physical debris ever could. Closer to the center, something stranger. A cluster of trees still standing, still upright, but every branch had been stripped away, every needle burned off. Just scorched trunks pointing at the sky, like a forest of telegraph poles. The blast had come from directly above them, so intense it stripped the trees bare without toppling them. The Evenki herders nearest the epicenter lost nearly everything. Reindeer herds were killed. Storage huts were flattened. Some herders described the sky appearing to split in two, with fire pouring across it. Some fled the area and didn't return for years. The Tunguska region in 1908 was so remote that there were no railways within hundreds of kilometers and no telegraph lines anywhere nearby. Whatever had just happened in that forest, the rest of the world wouldn't grasp the scale of it for years. At the Vahna-Va-Ra trading post, 60 kilometers from the epicenter, windows had shattered and buildings had shaken. Se-Me-Nof had been thrown from his porch. He was one of the luckiest people near the event. But even he had no idea what had actually caused it, because nobody anywhere did. What most people don't realize about Tunguska is that the planet didn't miss it. Seismographs in Irkutsk, hundreds of kilometers away, registered the shock within minutes. Barographs, instruments that measure atmospheric pressure, picked up the wave from the explosion across Eurasia. Scientists later determined that the atmospheric pressure wave had circled the globe, twice. Barograph stations in Britain recorded it passing through a second time, more than 30 hours after the initial event. And then there were the nights. For several days after the explosion, people across Europe experienced something that seemed beautiful, but was actually evidence of a catastrophe. The sky glowed, not at sunset, but all night. People in London, in Stockholm, in Berlin reported being able to read newspapers outdoors at midnight. Ships navigating the North Sea could see the horizon clearly in the middle of the night. The glow was caused by dust and ice particles from the explosion spreading through the upper atmosphere and scattering sunlight from below the horizon. The whole world had recorded the largest impact-type event in human history. Most people assumed it was just a remarkable summer. Russia's scientific community had the eyewitness accounts, they had the seismographic records, they had the newspaper reports of glowing European skies. What they didn't have was the ability to do much about it. The Tsarist government was already unraveling, and remote Siberian expeditions were not a priority. The revolution came in 1917, then civil war. Whatever lay in the Tunguska taiga was going to wait. And the longer it waited, the more the central question hardened. Nobody could agree on what the thing had been. That was about to become one man's obsession. Leonid Kolik was a mineralogist, a scientist specializing in minerals and meteorites, working for the Soviet Academy of Sciences. In 1921, while reviewing old meteorite incident reports, he came across the accounts from Vahna Ra and the contemporary press records about the glowing European skies. He became convinced that a massive meteorite had struck somewhere in Siberia and was still out there, waiting to be recovered. It took him 6 years to secure funding and permission. He finally reached the Tunguska region in 1927. The journey was brutal. Weeks of travel by train, then horse-drawn sled, then on foot through frozen taiga, guided by Evenki hunters who were reluctant to take him near a place many of them considered cursed. When his guides described the event in their own terms, the sky splitting, the air catching fire, Kolik was more convinced than ever that he was heading towards something extraordinary. What he expected was a crater, large enough to see from a ridge. A mass of iron or stone embedded in the earth that the Soviet Academy could study and catalogue. He carried the confidence of a man who had already reasoned out the answer and just needed to confirm it. He crested a ridge and looked out over the valley. What he saw made no scientific sense. Not at first, not if you were thinking about it the way everyone had been. Before getting to what Kulik found, it's worth pausing on the question that has occupied scientists ever since. What exactly was the Tunguska object? The mainstream consensus today is a stony asteroid, a rocky body perhaps 50 to 60 meters across, that detonated as a high-altitude airburst. Atmospheric modeling supports this, and microspherical analysis from the blast zone is consistent with a stony impactor. But some earlier researchers argued for a cometary fragment instead, a body composed largely of ice rather than rock. The main evidence for that theory is also its central puzzle. No significant solid fragments were ever recovered from the site. A comet would vaporize completely on detonation, leaving nothing behind. That's consistent with the evidence. A stony asteroid would leave at least some debris. So far, none has been conclusively identified at Tunguska. Then there's Lake Chaco, a lake about 8 kilometers from the estimated blast epicenter. In 2007, Italian researchers proposed that it might be an impact crater, formed by a piece of the object that broke off before the main detonation. The lake's unusual shape and depth looked suggestive, but many researchers have since re-examined the same data and found the dating inconsistent. The lake sediments appear to be centuries older than 1908. Both leading theories account for most of the evidence. Neither is fully airtight. Tunguska keeps its secrets. Now, the valley. 1927. The trees had fallen in a vast radial pattern, all pointing outward and away from a single point, as if blown flat from directly above. Later aerial surveys would show the pattern clearly, 2 lobes of flattened forest spreading from a central zone like a butterfly's wings. At the center of that zone, the standing trunks, every branch gone, every bit of bark scorched away. The telegraph pole forest, Kulik called it, and no crater, not anywhere. Kulik refused to accept it. He returned to the site 3 more times, in 1928, 1930, and 1939, because he couldn't believe what the evidence was telling him. He excavated boggy depressions, convinced they might be buried impact pits. They weren't. He spent years of his career and most of his scientific reputation searching for something that wasn't there. The thing that had done this had left no hole in the ground. None. That single fact, which seemed impossible, was actually the key to understanding everything. There was no crater because there was no impact. The object never hit the ground. What the physics eventually showed, and it took decades of atmospheric modeling to work this out completely, is that a stony asteroid doesn't arrive at the surface intact. As it plunges downward through the atmosphere at tens of thousands of kilometers per hour, the air in its path can't get out of the way fast enough. It compresses. It superheats. The pressure on the leading face of the rock builds until it exceeds the structural strength of the material. And then it doesn't crater the Earth, it explodes in the air. The Tunguska object, roughly 50 to 60 meters across, about the length of a city block, detonated somewhere between 5 and 10 kilometers above the taiga. All of its kinetic energy released at once, downward, into the forest below. That's what stripped every branch off every tree at the center while leaving the trunks standing. The blast came from above, not from the side. That's what flattened 80 million trees in a radial pattern, all pointing away from a single point in the sky. And that's why there was no crater. There was never going to be one. The answer to Ko-like's mystery had been in the evidence the whole time. Right there in the very pattern he was standing inside. There's a detail about June 30th, 1908, that puts the whole event in a different light. The object that detonated over Siberia arrived over an area containing almost no one. The Avenki herders nearest the blast lost their herds and their shelters. No confirmed human deaths were recorded. The nearest settlement of any size was 60 kilometers away. The nearest major city was hundreds of kilometers beyond that. Had the same object arrived hours earlier or later in the Earth's rotation, just a small shift in orbital timing, it could have detonated over St. Petersburg, or Warsaw, or London. An airburst of 10 to 15 megatons over a dense city would have been a catastrophe without precedent in recorded history. Geography and timing, that's the margin. Tunguska is now a founding case study for planetary defense, the scientific field that tracks near-Earth objects and models whether any of them might be on a collision course with us. Ko-like spent years looking for a meteorite that wasn't there. What he actually found was the proof that a cosmic object doesn't have to land to change everything. The sky doesn't need to leave a crater, it just needs to arrive. If this one kept you up tonight, good. New stories every day, Monday through Saturday. Subscribe so the next one finds you too. Follow the Unlit Room wherever you listen. Tell a friend who can't sleep. Full story on the main channel. Follow if you're wide awake. That was the Unlit Room. See you in the dark.